Good morning, everybody. My name is Sarah. It's Friday. The work week is finally coming to an end. Even though I am doing a work project tomorrow, the stressful part of the work week is over pretty much in the next 12 hours or so. But at any rate, I am taking a couple days off of training. Yesterday and today, I just aggravated my back injury. It's already feeling a little bit better today, but no big deal. Usually take a couple days of rest. It's mostly just kind of muscles locking up and not being pleased. I think I just actually wrenched it at work, so at any rate, I won't be on the bike today, but I thought that today might be a good day to talk about functional threshold power. And I want to kind of talk about it in a way that might demystify it for people who are beginners, who don't know power, who might be getting into using a power meter. I'm hoping to create a dialogue and talk about some things that'll be interesting to people who do use power, make you think about things in a different way. And I kind of want to talk about lactate threshold versus functional threshold power. We have kind of been trained to believe that those two things are one and the same. We use them interchangeably, but in reality there are some differences there if you talk about them in straight, like intrinsic terms, how lactate threshold works and how functional threshold power works. So I'm going to get right into it. Okay, so let's start out with the complete basics. First and foremost, you have your two acronyms that you will see a lot of in training plans, in literature for bicycling, and that talks about functional threshold power and lactate threshold. And your two acronyms, very easy, FTP for functional threshold power and LT for lactate threshold. Sometimes you will see the acronym LTHR, which is lactate threshold heart rate. So your established heart rate at which your lactate threshold is reached. You will see that sometimes in some training plans, so if you see that out there, that's what that means. So, as I said in the beginning of the video, functional threshold power and lactate threshold are actually two individual things, really kind of denoting two different ideas that seem to overlap in the middle, so we kind of use them interchangeably. But it's important that you understand the distinction because of what I'm going to talk about later in the video. So functional threshold power is widely accepted as being the amount of power that you can sustain for 1 hour. Your 1 hour power. That's what they say your functional threshold power is. It's what you can sustain consistently with no outside interference or other issues for 1 hour. Your lactate threshold is more of a physiological measurement. You can't actually measure your lactate threshold without going to a lab. And lactate threshold is actually the rate at which the lactate starts building in your blood exponentially at a rate that can no longer be removed from the blood by natural sources. So that's where doping and drug use and EPO comes into play. So your body is only able to clear lactate out of the blood so quickly. When you surpass your lactate threshold in terms of activity or exertion, your body is no longer able to clear that lactate and it starts to build up. And what happens is you get a degree of inflammation. A lot of people attribute the pain to the actual lactic acid. Lactic acid is just the byproduct of the body's response to exertion. That soreness and that burning that you feel is really just inflammation in the muscles. But it is a physiological response to the fact that you have reached a point where your body is producing more lactate than it can discard in the course of your exertion. Okay, so you might be thinking, all right, what's she talking about? If these are two different ideas, if these mean two different things, why do we use them interchangeably in the kind of the vernacular of cycling or endurance sports or really kind of sport as a whole these days? Well, the reason that we do that is because lactate threshold is kind of a physiological response. And really, like I said, the only way to have that tested is in the lab with somebody drawing blood and testing you. There's a couple different ways of doing this. There's like step tests. You can kind of look that up on your own. It's usually between $100 and $300 to get yourself a lactate threshold test. And usually what they're going to give you is heart rate, and they could probably give you an average power for that period of time. So you might be able to nail down your functional threshold power by getting, depending on what kind of test they use, if you get yourself a lactate threshold test. And it's pretty accurate. It tells you what your body is capable of doing. But what's going on physiologically inside is not really a construct of output as most of us can kind of understand day to day. So we looked for a straightforward way to test your threshold, to test your power, something that you can do at home, something that you don't have to do in a lab. And it was determined that, there were certain rates of being able to test yourself, to give yourself an on the bike kind of baseline for what kind of power you can sustain for a certain period of time. And your ability to kind of do that was a pretty close indication of what your threshold would be. So that's where functional threshold power, or FTP tests, come into play. And this is where things get really muddled. So in a perfect world, if you wanted to test your 1 hour power, your functional threshold power, you get out on your bike and you do a 1 hour time trial. The thing is, it's not a really practical test. There's mental considerations. There is, if you're out on the road, there's obviously traffic. There's going to be hindrances to you doing 1 hour power. And even on the trainer, most people will start to break down at the hour. Even if their body is capable of clearing the lactic acid, even if they are riding within their lactate threshold, there's a point that I think that most athletes, even the most seasoned athletes and even your professional athletes, focusing on holding that power for 1 hour is exceedingly difficult. You're going to see different types of breakdowns that is just not going to elicit a good result. So we found kind of these shortcut ways to test power. One of those, the industry standard right now, is the 20-minute FTP test, where you kind of get on your bike and you do some kind of openers and a warm-up, and you ride for 20 minutes at like a time trial pace, basically as hard as you can without blistering yourself apart. You take that number that you get, that average for that 20 minutes, you subtract about 5%, and you are supposed to have a pretty good estimate of your functional threshold power. And this has worked, and this has been something that people have used for the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years now. There's also another type of testing that has been used, and you see that more and more frequently. You can find it on Trainer Road, and some coaches are actually trying to use an 8-minute test. And this is really an 8-minute VO2 max test. So by testing your VO2 max threshold for that 8 minutes, you're able to kind of work backwards and grade yourself down by a certain percentage, and you can find what would be your threshold range. Again, it's still kind of an approximation. You can get yourself close, but you might not, hit the nail right on the head with that. Now, I think more and more coaches are starting to look at this, and as I kind of look at these testing protocols empirically, I think I see an inherent problem with the accuracy of both the 20-minute and the 8-minute test. And that is the fact that because of the short duration, you are able to train to the test. So what I mean by that is that you can train your body to withstand a high level of power and a high level of output for 20 minutes, or especially for 8 minutes. And you'll go out there and you'll rip yourself apart and turn yourself inside out for a 20-minute test, and you'll come up with your breakthrough, fantastic functional threshold power. But then when you go out on race day, or you go out and you try to do a time trial, you're wondering why you're undershooting that power. It's because you're able to train for the test. And it's not saying that people are cheating the functional threshold power test. It's that as we continue to do this, as we're conditioned to do this 20-minute test, every 3 to 4 weeks on the bike, you start to get to the point, it's like, okay, I know exactly how I can kind of pace myself out to squeak out those extra numbers so I can be I can win the FTP test. People who will, kind of sprint at the end. Yeah, it's going to raise your FTP test, but it's not an accurate reflection of what you're going to be able to withstand for 1 hour on the road if you were asked to kind of do that. You're going to get the same kind of issue with the 8-minute test. One of two things is going to happen there. A lot of people in the beginning stages who don't do a whole lot of VO2 max work or don't really know how to pace themselves for that could underestimate their power because they'll break down, or they'll start out in a gut-busting sprint and then they'll completely shred their legs and they'll get an abysmal result, and they'll try to work backwards to get their functional threshold power and not realize that they're capable of doing more. There's also the reverse phenomena where there are people who are built for high-end power, built to sprint, like, your bigger, your sprinters, your lead-out guys, who might be able to hold a really good, strong VO2 max effort for an 8-minute period of time. But when you work that backwards until your functional threshold, they're training to that high end, and they're not training to that meaty part of the bell curve. So they can overestimate their functional threshold power by using really kind of it's just not quite a sufficient test for the needs. So I think where this is going to get confusing is that people are going to say, okay, I'm doing my 20-minute test, and if I'm above my lactate threshold, I should be breaking down, right? Well, when we talk about lactate threshold and the lactate in the bloodstream building up faster than the body can clear it out, it's not like a finite point. There's not a line where it just says, okay, this is your ability to clear lactate, and once you move a centimeter past here, your body just breaks down. You can run in the red for a period of time. And that's why we subtract that 5% traditionally, because we know that there's a certain period of time that you can run over your lactate threshold, where you're kind of filling the paint can with a hole in the bottom with your lactate, and it's just kind of dripping out of the hole, and the more you start to build up in the can, the higher the pressure and the faster it starts to pour out of the hole. So you are going to get to a point of breakdown. If you're sprinting, you're going to fill that so much that it's just going to kind of overflow out of the top and just come spilling out of the bottom. But when it comes to a 20-minute test, some people are able to physically and mentally withstand some of that lactate coming out through that hole in the bottom of the paint can faster than others, which is where that training to the test comes in, where you're able to, kind of harden the fuck up and withstand the pain, and you can kind of overshoot that 5% and get yourself kind of an inaccurate result when it comes to your 1 hour FTP. Now, what I'm saying might fly in the face of a lot of proven and utilized testing protocols that people have been using for a number of years now. And the thing is, the things that we thought were correct 20 years ago are no longer correct now. And I think what people are finding now, we're starting to realize, okay, well, what we're using is good, but it's incomplete. We need to move on to the next stage. 20 minutes, in my opinion, in the opinion of some coaches and professionals and experts out in the field, is that 20 minutes is not quite a sufficient level of testing. It's still within that range of time that you can train to, that you can actually train your body to say, okay, I can reach for the moon for this 20 minutes, but you're reaching far beyond that 5% deduction that you're going to have at the end for your FTP test. So what I think is a more accurate test is a half an hour. 30 minutes is now you're kind of moving outside of that range that you can really train for. I'm not saying that you can't, but now you're doing half the distance. You're doing, half of the hour. So trying to break yourself down for half an hour, you have to be a little bit more mindful of pacing, a little bit more mindful of, okay, how long can I hold this for? You don't have quite as much ability to really cheat the test. And I think you're going to get a far better reflection. Now, some people do a 2x20 minute, where they'll break their body down in the first 20-minute segment, and then they'll take a quick, depending on what the test is, usually between 5 and 10-minute rest, and they'll do another 20-minute segment, and they'll take that second 20 minutes and use that as their FTP. That, to me, is a little bit more accurate, because you have already fatigued your body. So you can kind of take that as, okay, well, that person's already kind of broken down. They may have already started to build some lactate that's getting to that point where it's not being cleared out as quickly, and then they're restarting a new test. So the 2x20 is definitely a lot more, I think, accurate. But I think if people start instituting a 30-minute test, you're going to start seeing a lot more stable results and a lot more effective zone training. Like I said, it's great to say, oh, my FTP is higher. Oh, my FTP is 5 watts higher. It's 10 watts higher. I broke my personal best on this 20-minute test. But if you go out on race day and you're not even reaching your FTP when you're in a hard race, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with your numbers, and people aren't understanding and they're not able to kind of look at their training in an empirical manner and understand what's going on. You know, if you're going to get a power meter and if you're going to start training with power, the importance is that you can use those numbers. It's not really supposed to be a badge of honor. It's supposed to be so that you can use those numbers to create training zones, to analyze your training, to see what things work for you, to see if changes that you've made to either your position, to your equipment, to your training protocols, if those are yielding empirical, objective results. So one testing protocol that I saw online, I will see if I can find it again. I'm not really certain who published this, but I thought it was a really effective, common sense way to perform a functional threshold power test. And what this was a 30-minute test. And what he would do is he would take the full 30 minutes of power, he would average that and reduce it by about the 5% to get your 1 hour power. And it was pretty accurate. And then what he would do to get your lactate threshold heart rate is he would disregard the first 10 minutes and he would only take the last 20 minutes because you're going to get an artificial low in the first 10 minutes because your heart rate is still starting to build and peak. So he kind of threw out that low end of the spectrum and he waited for the heart rate to kind of, okay, let's hit its peak, let's hit that kind of flat line where it's not really oscillating by much more than a couple of beats, and we'll take that 20-minute chunk, we'll take it out of the system, and that will be your lactate threshold heart rate. And to me, I think if you look at it objectively, it's a very accurate and in a very comprehensive way to test out your power. This is a test that I have not done yet. This is a test that I am looking at probably doing in the next week or so because I think it is going to be more effective than a 20-minute test. And I think you're going to get a more true result of what's going on. You may find your power is higher on a test like this because in 20 minutes, mentally, you're trying to overshoot and then you kind of die towards the end. Or you're going to find that your power is a little bit lower because, let's face it, regardless of whether you've meant to, you've trained yourself to become impervious to the 20-minute test, and you're able to do a little bit more than the 5% extra that we're going to subtract off the back end to give you your 1 hour power. Now, when it comes to beginners, when you get a power meter, in the very beginning, it's going to be completely useless to you. When I first bought my power meter, I just put it on my bike and I let it collect data. And I would just kind of make it a point to remember what my perceived exertion was, or I would go back on the map. And this is where Strava is actually very nice because it's a very nice, easy user interface where you can take your cursor and run it along the map, and you might be able to find that segment, you can find that hill, and then along the bottom, along the analysis line, you can see where your power was, and you can kind of look at that and you can kind of compute, okay, this was a really hard effort for me, and I was at 325 watts. That was, for me, I couldn't hold that more than a minute or two. It gives you kind of a baseline to work with. And as you use your power meter over the first couple of weeks, you start to see more trends, you start to collect data, and you kind of know where you stand. I would not recommend going out and buying a power meter and immediately doing a 20-minute test. Unless you've kind of done testing for your heart rate before. If you're just getting into the cycling game or you're just getting into using power, you probably don't know what you're looking at, you don't know what you're targeting, you don't know how to pace yourself. So a 20-minute test is going to be pretty much garbage for you. It's not going to give you an accurate reflection of where you stand. I don't think anybody's ever really recommended to go buy a power meter, pull it out of the box, put it on your bike, calibrate it, and just ride for 20 minutes, as hard as you can. You could probably get something close, but a lot of people who do a 20-minute test know approximately where their power is, so that they can kind of look down and they can see if they're on pace and they can see how they feel. If you're looking down at that number and it's complete Swahili to you, you don't know if you're undershooting or you're overshooting. You could feel fine the first 5 minutes. Everything after that is going to be absolutely horrendous. So if you're going to get a power meter for the first time, just use it for a couple weeks. Pay attention to that data, look around, let it pique your curiosity until you get some rides under your belt. It's not going to be any formative data. So when you get your $500,000, $1,500, whatever power meter, you put it on your bike, You're not going to be able to play with your new toy in a real formative way for the first couple of weeks. But as you do the same routes a couple times and you look and you see how it computes your average power and your normalized power, and you know what kind of perceived exertion you put in the ride, you'll start to kind of be able to make best guesstimates as to where you stand. And if you really pay attention to it, you say, okay, I'm ready to do my FTP test. I'm ready to get on the bike and do a 30-minute test and say, all right, I think my FTP is probably somewhere around 250 watts. I'm just picking a number out of the clear blue sky, not so clear. And maybe you'll target that 250 watts. And maybe you'll hit that easy with flying colors. That's fine. Your first couple of tests are probably going to be yourself, feeling yourself out, seeing how you respond. Okay, you undershot. The next time you do a test, maybe you aim for 275 watts. Or if you really grossly undershot, maybe you aim for 300 watts. You start to kind of dial in, and it's going to take a couple months before you really understand your power, what it means, and before testing becomes effective. But as soon as you kind of get into it and you put a little attention into observing the trends and what you're doing, it's going to yield really good training. It's just a great training tool for you. It lets you, kind of dial in your zones. It lets you kind of go out there and reach out for training plans, whether you're going to buy a training plan, get a training plan from a coach, create your own training plan, train for racing. It allows you to kind of have an empirical way to look at the data on your computer screen and say, yeah, I'm hitting my objectives and that feels easy, or that feels hard, or I can do better, or I'm going to make a goal of doing this in 4 weeks. So power can be a really effective tool, but could also be it could be really daunting. There's a lot of conflicting information out there, and even the information now in 2017 and testing protocols and preconceived notions of what kind of works, you're just now starting to see a shift. Like I talked about the 20-minute test. There's still the standard. There's still the go-to, the 20-minute test. It's kind of an easy, it's a third of an hour. It's a period of time that people can commit to. You get pretty close. You're not way off the mark here. But as people want to get more and more accurate results, and people are looking for that percentage, that small, nominal gain, give you that edge and give you that little bit more accuracy. I mean, we're creating power meters that are within 1% or less of accuracy at this point. Well, you should apply that same mentality to your training if you think it's that important in your equipment. We're starting to dial in techniques and protocols for testing and training that are starting to shift a little bit again. So do your own research if you're interested. There's a lot of articles online that you can read. Andrew Coggin wrote a book called Training and Racing with a Power Meter. It's very technical, but if you're interested in kind of the geek speak of power and you're interested in how the mechanics work, it's definitely a book I would recommend looking at, but it could be a little bit abstract for most people, especially beginners getting into training with a power meter or racing with a power meter. And it might be one of those, okay, once I kind of get a handle on what's going on in my training, let me go back and read that. Joe Friel, again, I've mentioned him before. He's done a lot in terms of the endurance world, in terms of cycling, running, triathlon. He writes a number of articles. He's got his books, the training Bible for cycling, and I think he's got the triathlete's training Bible as well. And he's revised those a couple of times, so I think he's on his 3rd edition. And he also keeps up a blog and writes up several articles where he kind of extrapolates on what's going on. He amends his opinion. He comes up with new and fresh information. He has not rested on the laurels of the books that he's written for years. He's constantly providing new, fresh information. So that's a great source to seek out too. I believe that he writes it in a way that's relatable, in a way that you can understand. He'll make analogies so that people can understand what he's referring to. But at any rate, that's my power speech, I guess. This is kind of what I think, this is kind of what I've observed. These are things that I kind of want to take into this season, try out some new testing protocols. 30 minutes is going to be challenging. It's going to be a completely different way of doing a threshold test because, like I said, we have trained ourselves to that 20-minute test. So if you guys have any comments, questions, concerns, this is probably going to be a piece of information or a video that's going to be striking up a little bit of controversy because of preconceived ideas of what FTP is and what training protocols are and what your coach has told you and what articles have told you. Information is changing all the time. I'm just going by, my own research, my own opinion. If you guys have varying opinions, let me know in the comments below. I'm always interested in what other people have researched on their own, what other people have tested on their own, real life testing experience with things. I'm always interested in learning from you guys as those commenting, but I thought that this might be something interesting to share that will help people either look at power in a different way or people look at power for the first time and maybe find a way to kind of understand it so that it makes sense. But I'm going to end the video here. I'm going to get myself to work. Very low-key, very rainy, very gross, very boring. But I'm hoping to be back on the bike tomorrow. I guess it was my body's way of saying, hey, take those 2 rest days, asshole, and go back to your training. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.